Hi, I'm Todd Wood. Thanks for watching my video lecture here on natural evil. This was recorded March 27, 2018 at Core Academy of Science in Dane, Tennessee. The specific subject of the lecture is animal death and suffering and human death and suffering. I don't really want to belabor that because you can just watch the video and find out what it's about. But there is one thing that I felt that I didn't really clarify perfectly to my satisfaction in the lecture, so I wanted to add this little introduction here, and that is my own position on the matter. I affirm, fully and without reservation, the traditional creationist understanding that animal death and suffering originated at the fall and the curse as described in Genesis 3. I have no hesitation about that, and that is exactly where my thinking on the subject begins. At the same time, I recognize that that raises a host of challenging biological questions. And honestly, some theological questions as well. I want to look back into the tradition of the church and understand what other people have thought about the subject prior to the advent of evolution, when that began to bias everybody's thinking on the matter. So that's where all this work that I'm about to describe in my lecture came from. So I wanted to make sure that we all understood that. We're all on the same page when we get started here so that I don't get any angry emails, if you know what I'm talking about. So thanks for watching. God bless and enjoy. Thank you for coming. I'm Todd Wood. I'm president of Core Academy of Science. And tonight I want to talk about one of the most challenging questions that we have here, not just as biologists, but as Christians. This is a problem that has sort of vexed the church for a long time, and it is the problem of evil. And I'm going to take a spin on it tonight that's going to be a little different because I'm a biologist interested in what I'm going to call biological evil, and we're going to sort of wrestle with that and try to understand what that all means. And I also want to confess ahead of time here, just last week, I saw the movie The Riot and the Dance, featuring my former professor, Gordon Wilson. That has really influenced how I designed this presentation tonight, so I wanted to make sure that I gave him credit. Thanks, Gordon. That was awesome. And if you haven't seen it, you absolutely need to go see it. It will be at an encore presentation, I believe, on April 19. So, yeah, get your tickets and go see it because it's well worth it. I don't know where it's going to be, but I'm totally going, and I'm going to take some notes this time because I need to remember things better. Anyway, so let's talk natural evil. So what do we mean by this notion of natural evil? Well, typically, philosophers, theologians sort of distinguish two forms of evil. Moral evil, that is caused by intelligent agents, death and suffering perpetrated by specifically human agents who ought to know better, right? And then natural evil would be death and suffering that are not directly caused by human agents that ought to know better. So on the left here is the crematorium at Dachau, which is a Nazi prison camp in southern Germany where 32,000 people, more than 32,000 people, were killed during the Holocaust. And that is a clear example of moral evil where we can point the finger at specific individuals who were responsible for perpetrating this wickedness. On the right is an image from just last year. Those are hurricanes Katia, Maria, and Jose. The 2017 hurricane season was massive, famously so already. It wiped out much of the Caribbean, caused more than $200 billion in damage, and directly killed more than 1,000 people. The numbers are difficult to get perfectly precise because there was so much devastation. The islands still haven't fully recovered. And so, whereas we can point the finger at people who caused the Holocaust, you don't point the finger at people who caused hurricanes. It's just something that happens. So philosophically then, we can see the classic problem of evil here. The premise that God is omnipotent, that he possesses all power. He is omnibenevolent, he is all good, he possesses all goodness. And we also observe that natural evil exists, that there are terrible storms that produce death and suffering. There are terrible things out there that can cause great suffering. And so the conclusion, we can conclude either that God is willing to stop evil but is incapable of doing so, which would mean that he is not really omnipotent, he does not possess all power, or that God is capable of stopping evil, but he won't, in which case he is not really good, he is something else. Or the simpler solution to the problem that most atheists will tell you is simply that there is no God. God is self-contradictory. This notion, this whole problem of evil is insurmountable, and there is no solution, and that's why there is no God. And your classical Christian theologian would say the whole argument here is just oversimplified. We can't just boil it down to, God is great and there's real evil and that sort of thing. It's more complicated than that. And it's at least conceivable that we could imagine a God who is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, nevertheless tolerating for a time the natural suffering of creation. That gets a little dicey when you want to get really specific about it, but that's basically the formula of the answers that Christian theologians have come up with. I'm not really going to belabor the problem of evil. I'm far more interested in the biology, so let's think more about the natural evil. And I'm going to agree with my friends who have gently remonstrated with me about using the term natural evil. It's difficult to call natural evil evil when you realize that God is the cause of these things. There is no question that God is the cause of these things. We see numerous examples in Scripture. I've just listed a few here. The flood in Genesis 6 through 9, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by raining fire down from the sky. There was probably an earthquake involved in that as well. The plagues of Egypt, famines, plagues, and earthquakes throughout the history of Israel. God is the author of what we think of as natural evil, which makes me extremely uncomfortable calling it evil because God is not evil, right? So we need a better understanding or a better term. And maybe we can use suffering. I have used the term imperfection previously when referring to his creation. Perhaps there are things about it that are not the way he wanted it in the beginning, but he has changed things as a result of the fall, that sort of thing. But as I keep mentioning here, I'm interested especially in the realm of biology and the biological evil that potentially exists. So this doctor here is holding in his hands a mass of ascaris worms, roundworms that were passed by a young child in Kenya. These at one point blocked the intestines of a human being. They're kind of nasty. And yet at the same time, they are amazingly complex. The life cycle of ascaris is remarkable. First of all, you have to swallow an infective egg to start that life cycle. The egg will go through your digestive system. In the small intestine, the larvae hatch and then invade the blood by burrowing through the intestinal wall. They ride the circulatory system to the lungs of all places, where they mature for about 2 weeks and then climb up the trachea. And this is just a lovely thought. They climb up the trachea so they can be swallowed again. So they go through 2 cycles of being swallowed. Once back in the intestines, they can mature to adulthood and then begin laying eggs again. And the eggs then, once they are fertilized, they can be passed by defecation. And if your water supply is not well tended, then you can become reinfected. The severity of the infection with these worms depends on your parasite load. If you only have one or two of them, you probably might not even notice it. If you end up with a mass of them in your intestines, they can block your intestines. They can cause malnutrition because the worms eat all your food and you don't get any. So they can be nasty. Other parasites, other parasitic worms are even more remarkable. They have multiple hosts that they have to go through. Another example here of what we might think of as biological evil, a good old mosquito, right? This mosquito is called Anopheles. Anopheles comes from the Greek and it means useless. So, yeah, that's how excited people are about mosquitoes. This particular mosquito is filling her abdomen there with blood, lovely, and she has inserted her proboscis into this poor person's hand. The mosquitoes are members of the family Culicidae. There are about 3,500 described species of mosquito in the world. Only the females bite, and they inject the salivary enzymes and other stuff into your body while they're sucking your blood to make it easier to suck the blood. That's the thing that makes the bumpy, scratchy bit after you get bitten, right? The blood that they suck is used specifically, it's digested and used to basically fuel the production of mosquito eggs. So every time you get bit by a mosquito, that is one more female mosquito that is going to lay a gazillion more eggs in some standing bucket of water somewhere. And I have been amazed in my lifetime coming across mosquito larvae in the craziest places. Mosquito larvae can grow, it seems like, just about anywhere. There are, in fact, a small number of mosquitoes that can lay their eggs without a blood meal, but most of them have to have some sort of blood meal. Now, the males don't bite. Instead, they feed on nectar. And ironically enough, the mosquito is the deadliest animal on the planet. At least 500,000 people a year alone are killed by malaria, which is carried and transmitted by mosquitoes. And mosquitoes transmit a whole host of other diseases that also kill a bunch of people every year. So, of all the strange creatures on this planet that we are afraid of, spiders, snakes, whatnot, the mosquitoes, which we find mildly annoying in this country, turn out to be the deadliest of all of them. This guy is another example of what we might think of as biological evil. I just want to brag, I took this picture. I got right up next to him to take this picture. At a snake farm. There was a nice thick piece of glass between us. So it's pretty cool. I love that shot. You can see he's got that little pit there, right there between below the nostril and the eye. That pit, this by the way is a timber rattlesnake, Crotalus horridus. It is, the pit there is used for heat sensing. So even in the dark, these guys can detect movement using their pits. That's why they're called pit vipers. Rattlesnakes are deaf, but they are nevertheless able to detect vibrations through their skin. So, as I said, even in the dark, with the pits and the skin, they can actually track prey pretty well. The rattling, we think, is used to warn predators of the snakes. And you might be thinking, what in the world would prey on a rattlesnake? Actually, a lot of things prey on rattlesnakes. If they can get that pointy end away from them and not get bit, then they would be happy to eat a rattlesnake. Birds, in particular, love to eat snakes. The western timber rattler actually accounts for the most snake bite deaths in the United States, but still, of all the snake bite deaths there are in the U.S., there's only about 5 to 6 every year. In fact, you are 10 times more likely to be hit by lightning and die that way than you are to be bitten by a snake and die that way. So the next time you think about, I don't necessarily want to go in the woods and look for rattlesnakes, it's fine. Go on. It's no big deal. So those are some examples of the sorts of things that keep me up at night wondering about God's benevolence and the design of creation. It's really hard for me to look at things like the mosquito or the rattlesnake or the Ascaris worm and say, this is some evil plot of Satan, or this was never meant to happen. This is something that is just an accident. It seems to me that these are beautifully designed creatures that are beautifully designed to do exactly what they do in all their scariness and weirdness and danger, right? At the same time, I could also note a few things here that I think are really important. One of those, only 85% of Ascaris infections are actually symptomless. You wouldn't even know that you had them, which is a strange result. It's only when you have a large load of parasites that you start to have symptoms, which include, pain and malnutrition and that sort of thing. So mosquitoes are annoying, but as long as they don't actually carry disease, that's about as much as they are. They're annoying. And then rattlesnakes, the reason there's very few rattlesnake deaths in the United States is because rattlesnakes don't like to be around people. So is this really biological evil? Should we be calling rattlesnakes and parasites evil? Is that really fair? And we've already kind of said that it's really not fair to call natural evil evil because God is the author of so much of it. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And we might also point out here that death is important. And to give a perfect example of this, let's look at St. Matthew Island, which is found here off the coast of Alaska. St. Matthew Island was the site of an unplanned experiment here in the latter half of the 20th century. In 1944, during World War II, the U.S. Coast Guard, which had a station there on St. Matthew Island, they introduced reindeer into the island to serve as an emergency food source in case somehow their supply ships didn't make it to them. Then after the war, the station was abandoned, and so were the reindeer. The reindeer were left there. And people began to monitor the population. And on the island, naturally, the largest predator there was the Arctic fox, which is itty-bitty. And you can imagine what happened. As long as there was food, the reindeer population basically exploded and far exceeded the island's capacity to support the population. And when a severe winter hit and limited their food supply, 99% of the population was wiped out. Until about 1980, when we last checked and there were no detectable reindeer left on the island. So life without predators in our world is just as devastating, it seems, as life with predators. Predators serve an important purpose of regulating population sizes. This is why so many people hit deer with their cars now, because there are no cougars. We got rid of the cougars, we got rid of the bears, we got rid of all the wolves, the things that would naturally eat the deer, and now they're basically hoofed rats. And they're everywhere, and we hit them with our cars. And that's the main population control, I guess, hunting too. So we see here that death has a function, because without death, we would be overrun with vermin in very short order. In fact, mice breed every couple weeks, so the mice alone would take over the world rather quickly if there was no animal death to check that and prevent it. So predators, in fact, are good things in our modern world, and I'm not sure that we can have the world that we live in without predators. It's not really, I think, feasible to even consider that. So that's nice, that's death, but what about suffering? So if death is necessary, is it necessary that things actually suffer? And this has been sort of the focus of people's questions over the years. So here's an example of suffering. Doesn't look like suffering, but this is a molecular structure of a protein called, oddly enough, protective antigen. Molecular biologists have terrible names for things because this is not protective at all. This is the thing that is produced by anthrax bacteria. It lands on the outer surface of your cell and it injects a thing called lethal factor inside of the cell. Guess what lethal factor does? It's lethal, right? It kills things, and so you die. The progression of anthrax, it begins, you feel like kind of lousy, like you got a cough, and then the next thing you know, you kind of feel like you got the flu, and you're kind of coming down with something. And by the time you realize there's something really wrong with you, and you ought to maybe go to the doctor, it's too late. And within 24 hours, you could be dead. It goes that fast. And it is a miserable, unpleasant way to go, both physically, because your cells are dying everywhere, and psychologically, because you realize, if I had gone to the doctor when I first started feeling bad, maybe I wouldn't die. And yet, there you are, being pumped full of antibiotics in a desperate attempt to keep you alive. That's all because of that thing right there, that protein. This water buffalo here, anybody know what those birds are? They're called oxpeckers. Folk tales tell you that oxpeckers go around pecking insects off of water buffaloes. That's generally what they are known for. In fact, it turns out, after some direct research on the question, oxpeckers are parasites. They go around pecking open bloody wounds and sores and drink the blood of ox and other large animals in Africa. They also go inside of the ears of the animals and eat their earwax. Lovely. So oxpeckers are incredibly annoying. They are a great source of suffering for African animals. Another example of suffering here. This poor individual, see that ugly white thing coming out of their leg there? That is a guinea worm. Oh, lovely. We've talked a little bit about parasites with Ascaris. This is basically sort of the same thing. You get it by drinking contaminated water. The water has to be contaminated with an infected water flea. In your digestive system, you digest away the water flea, but because the water flea is infected, it's infected with a larvae of the guinea worm, and the guinea worm larvae does not get digested. Instead, it burrows through your intestine wall, surprise, surprise, and goes into your bloodstream, where it matures into an adult of approximately 2 to 3 feet long and the size of a strand of spaghetti. Yes, that's nasty. And then when it's ready to reproduce, because it's in your flesh, not in your intestine, it burrows its way out, usually on your legs. And the idea is that you go to the water to drink or whatever, and the female will then lay larvae into the water and contaminate it again. It can release millions of larvae into the water. And obviously, it's extremely unpleasant when it comes out, and you can imagine getting it out would be a nightmare. Generally speaking, I've seen people wind it around a stick and pull it out a little bit at a time to get rid of it. That's the way they get rid of it. It's a miserable thing. And if that wasn't gross enough, this will really make you squirm. This poor soul, that cloudy thing in his pupil there, is the cysticercus of a pork tapeworm that has gotten lodged in its eye. The cysticercus is the little cyst with the tiny larvae in it that usually goes into the muscle and lodges, the muscle of the pig, and then you eat the pig and you don't actually cook it enough, and that's how you contract these nasty things. This poor soul, it didn't lodge in its muscle, it went into his eye. It can cause the retina to detach, basically cause you to go blind. It is a miserable, miserable thing. This is suffering. This is what biology is about, right? So when, I hear, well, we'll get to that later. I don't want to get on my soapbox just yet. That comes later. All right, so what does the Bible actually have to say about this sort of thing? Does it have anything to tell us about predators and death and suffering in the animal world? Well, yes, actually it has quite a lot to say about it. Not any of it is terribly specific enough to know exactly how to react to all this stuff. And that's been part of my ongoing work now. I'm sort of trying to wrestle with this whole issue, try to understand it biblically, theologically, and scientifically together, which is really difficult. So Genesis 1:30 here says, "To every beast of the earth and to every bird of the heavens and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. So if we take that at face value, it seems like God created a world in which animals were intended, and people were intended to eat plant material. We were supposed to be vegetarians. We are not anymore. So thank you, Lord, I like bacon. But in the beginning, it was not so. Just make sure you cook the bacon thoroughly, right? All right. Later then in Genesis 3, we see God cursing creation because of Adam's sin. There's a number of things that God specifies in the curse, and one of them here at the very end, "By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." That's Genesis 3:19. He's talking to Adam there. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. People tell me, God is only cursing Adam with spiritual death. Spiritual death really doesn't have anything to do with dust and turning back into dust. That's obviously an allusion to physical death. Then on the other hand, we also see passages like Psalm 104, "The young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God." There seems to be, at least in Psalm 104, this idea that the creation as we have it now is in fact good. Just like I sort of got figured out from biology, you need predators to control the population of other animals. So predators are good, and here the psalmist seems to say that they're getting their food from God. On the other hand, Psalm 17 seems to make an allusion to lions as being bad, right? "Keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings. From the wicked who do me violence, my deadly enemies who surround me, he is like a lion eager to tear, as a young lion lurking in ambush." So there, the psalm writer seems to be comparing the evil people who are enemies to the lions who lay in wait and lurk and try to destroy things. The most striking passage, I think, of all of these comes from Isaiah's vision of the coming kingdom of God, where he describes in detail here, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fatted calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." Now, some people have in history tried to say that this is an allegory referring to different hostile tribes and nations that will all be at peace finally in the coming kingdom. And others have read this as exactly what it sounds like, that the kingdom of God will actually include lions, leopards, bears, cobras, and adders. Cool. And they will be very different from what they are now. So how do we make sense of all of this then? Is there a way? to make sense of all of this. On the one hand, death is now necessary to our world. It is unquestionably good. I am deeply grateful for all the snakes that eat the mice. I am quite grateful for all the bats that eat the mosquitoes. That's a good thing. Those are necessary. Suffering, however, still leaves us with discomfort and sympathy. So seeing those images of those people suffering with those bizarre parasites makes us sort of queasy and unhappy. It's awkward and unpleasant, and it makes us wonder why. And then we see the Bible describing this time in the beginning when dangerous animals ate plants, and then the coming kingdom in which they will be dangerous no longer. And yet, at the same time, the Bible also describes God as the caretaker and provider for lions looking for animals to eat. So, how do we make sense of this? So, as I said, I've been trying to research this in my own time, spare time, of which I have much, as you probably guessed. And so this talk was good for me because it got me back into that work, trying to sort of sort through this. And I've got a few quotations here from the church tradition, church fathers, that may help us to sort of try to sort this out and figure out how we should be reading the scriptures. First here comes from Theophilus of Antioch. This is Antioch. That was Paul's home base, where he would go out on his missionary journeys from Antioch. Theophilus was a bishop there about 100 years later. And this is a pretty long passage, but I think it's worth reading through. The animals are named wild beasts from their being hunted, not as if they had been made evil or venomous from the first. For nothing was made evil by God, but all things good, yea, very good. But the sin in which man was concerned brought evil upon them. For when man transgressed, they also transgressed with him. For as if the master of the house himself acts rightly, the domestics also of necessity conduct themselves well. But if the master sins, the servants also sin with him. So in like manner it came to pass that in the case of man's sin, he being master, all that was subject to him sinned with him. When therefore man again shall have made his way back to his natural condition, and no longer does evil, those also shall be restored to their original gentleness. So Theophilus here seems to be reading this the way a modern sort of creationist would read it. He seems to be saying there was a time in the beginning when there were no dangerous animals, and that was changed at the fall of Adam. When Adam, the master of creation, the person who had dominion over creation, when he sinned, he brought judgment on the whole thing. The whole household was judged. And later then, we can look forward again to the time that Isaiah prophesies when this gentleness of animals will be restored as God originally intended. A little later than Theophilus, not quite later, but Irenaeus here, maybe 20 years later, probably a contemporary. Irenaeus was Bishop of Lyon, which is in southern France. And he writes this against heresies. It is right that when the creation is restored, all the animals should obey and be in subjection to man, and to revert to the food originally given by God. That is, the production of the earth. And this indicates the large size and rich quality of the fruits. For if that animal, the lion, feeds upon straw, of what a quality must the wheat itself be, whose straw shall serve as suitable food for lions? So he is literally here commenting on Isaiah's visions of the coming kingdom, and talking about the plants must also be restored to something amazing if lions are going to be able to eat them and survive. That's kind of a different way of thinking about it. But again, we have this notion that creation is in fact fallen and will be restored at some point in the future. Now, Augustine is fairly well known in this discussion as being one who takes a different view. So I've been reading Augustine, and I'm not so sure I understand exactly what Augustine is trying to say. Perhaps it's lost in translation. Maybe I need to get out the original Greek and check him out. But here's one thing that he has to say in the literal meaning of Genesis. The question is also commonly asked about various poisonous and dangerous animals, whether they were created after the sin of man as a punishment, or rather had already been created as harmless and only began after that to do sinners harm. Daniel survived safe and sound and fearless among the lions, while the apostle had a deadly viper clinging to his arm and doing him no harm. So it would have been quite possible for these creatures to do no harm when they were created. So Augustine here seems to be saying, yeah, when there was the original creation, it was all benevolent and not dangerous. People would not have had any problem. Just like Daniel didn't have any problem with the lions, and Paul didn't have problems being bitten by that viper. So too, that's how we would have lived back then had we been there before the sin of Adam. You literally turn to the next page, and he's got slightly different perspective on things. Then why do beasts injure one another? For the simple reason, of course, that some are the proper diet of others. Nor can we have any right to say there shouldn't be some on which others feed. All things, you see, as long as they continue to be, have their own proper measures, numbers, and destinies. So now he seems to be saying that there's a different standard for animals treating or animals relating to other animals. Animals relating to people in the beginning, it would have been benevolent and kind. Adam had dominion and would have been the master of all the animals, and none of them would have injured him. But animals relating to other animals? Oh, yeah, they could have eaten them. Yeah, totally, no problem. So Augustine here has a kind of a complex idea, I think, that's a little bit different than just saying there's no problem with predators in the beginning. Augustine clearly has in mind something a lot more nuanced than just saying, yeah, predators are fine. And then I have an example here from the Venerable Bede, English monk from the 7th century, 7th and 8th century, in his On Genesis. For in the first creation, the other living creatures were made immediately in such a way that either they would die as nourishment for others, or they would perish in their declining age from lack of same. So Bede here seems to be saying animals were created completely mortal and capable of dying, and that they would have been eaten by predators, and that's okay. So what do Christians think about the origin of predators? You got me. They seem to think all sorts of different things. Is there a consensus? I am not sure. I've been sort of dabbling in this for a couple of years now. I've only really begun recently to sort of really intensely look for how Christians treat the existence of dangerous animals like predators. What I've come to understand here is that it's definitely more complicated than a lot of people want you to think. It is not the unambiguous, clear teaching of Scripture about any particular thing. There are enough ambiguities in the text that you can have different perspectives, just like Augustine has, that's different from anything else that I've run into. There is, however, one modern attitude that I think I find very difficult to reconcile with the hope that's communicated in Isaiah's vision. And here is that modern attitude. On the question of animals preying upon one another, the only question open to us is whether it be ultimately evil. Immortality upon this earth is out of the question. Without death, there could be no animal happiness. When we reflect on this struggle, we may console ourselves with the full belief that the war of nature is not incessant, that no fear is felt, that death is generally prompt, and that the vigorous, the healthy, and the happy survive and multiply. Now, who do you suppose wrote this? Any guesses? Do you think they're both communicating sort of the same thing? The two paragraphs here? They sure sound very similar to me. In fact, the first one is William Paley, author of Natural Theology, the guy who not invented, but he popularized the notion of design, how you find a watch in a field and it's got all the parts working together, and so it evidences design. For Paley, noxious animals, venomous animals, animals that are dangerous, they're part of creation. They have to be there. It is necessary for them to be there. And the things that they prey upon, well, they die quick, and so it's fine. The second quote comes from Origin of Species, Darwin. And it's weird to me. It is super weird, and I haven't seen a lot of people comment on this. But Darwin's view of death in the animal world is essentially the same as Paley's. Death is swift. They don't feel much. The healthy and the happy are the ones that survive and multiply. Yay! That strikes me as so very strange that Paley and Darwin, who are generally considered to be the exact opposite, Darwin replaced Paley, they're exactly cut from the same cloth when it comes to understanding what death is all about. It makes me uncomfortable as I read this because it seems to be minimizing the suffering in the animal world. It seems to be almost patronizing in the way that Darwin here is trying to minimize it. No fear is felt. I don't think so. If there was no fear felt, those antelope would never run from that lion, right? And we've all seen enough National Geographic to know exactly what happens when they catch wind of that lion coming. They are out of there really fast. Death is generally prompt. Oh, how I wish that were true. Death doesn't have to be prompt at all. Suffering can go on for quite a long time. And the vigorous and healthy and happy survive and multiply. They survive and multiply by killing all the weaklings, right? That's the part that Darwin leaves out here. The only way the happy ones and healthy ones survive is by killing off all those weaklings. It doesn't strike me as a very good way of thinking about natural evil. And I'm sure Darwin would draw a big distinction between what happens in the animal world and what happens in the human world. But there are those who came later that did not make such a distinction. So as we think through the suffering of animals, I don't think I have a convenient solution to the whole question here. There seems to be a lot of possibilities in the text of the Bible that I don't know that I always had thought about. There seems to be a beautiful design to it in the world that strikes me as important. And yet suffering is also gratuitous and unnecessary, and it's everywhere. So I just want to, close by looking back at Isaiah's prophecy here. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra. The weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. So as I ponder the scary parts of biology, I have to think here as I look at Isaiah's prophecy, even if I don't understand it, there is hope for the future. And maybe even a snake can long for redemption, just like I do. No? Don't think so? No.